Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the terrific work being done by folks who have used the historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support from the Hagley Center in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds. One such scholar joins me today. Monica Geraffo is a PhD candidate at the University of California at Los Angeles. Monica, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it you're researching and writing about?
So the elevator pitch for my PhD dissertation is essentially the use of synthetic fabrics by French couturiers in the early Cold War period. So that's roughly 1945 to 1969. And I'm broadly speaking looking at the ways that both the US and USSR sort of used France as this arbiter of taste in order to create a common language that allowed them to, as I would say, sort of create comparisons that then elevated or endorsed their synthetic and chemical ventures as sort of being something that would be worthy of high fashion, right? Or worthy of, if it's worthy of the best, then it's also worthy of the mass market, right? So I'm looking at the ways that those French couturiers are pretty specifically courted by chemical industries, manufacturers in both the US and USSR for the use of their synthetic textiles.
What a unique way to get at that Cold War rivalry.
That was my hope, right? Was that we really talk about the Cold War as being a binary a lot of times. And I mean, we're also talking about a country that's sitting literally in the middle. So we have these huge anxieties of like, if nuclear war is to break out, like there is absolutely the opportunity, that they might miss, right? And we are the countries that are literally in the way of that. But then there is also the fact that there is actually a lot of international competition happening on international stages in that period, despite the fact that we talk about like a very impenetrable like Berlin Wall, right? Is that there are World's Fairs happening, there are Olympics happening, there are all of these opportunities for actually people to see firsthand these like comparisons happening between the US and USSR in person. And a lot of them are either happening in France or they're being compared to versions of French culture. And to me, that was very interesting because it challenges what we think we know about such an established period of history.
Yeah, so in that way, high fashion becomes sort of a lens through which to understand these bigger, more complicated things.
Exactly. Fashion is something for me that I really think of as being I mean, it's economic history, and when you look at economic history, then you're going to be looking at like larger geopolitical stakes, right? And when you look at something like licensing technologies, import-export laws, even this idea of for something like the USSR that's really having, it's just been, I don't want to say like given, but given a whole bunch of countries at the end of World War II that are now
Mhm.
part of the Soviet Union that have always had their own very distinct historical identity that really don't consider themselves to be Soviet or Russian in any way. They really consider themselves to be European. And so you're having to really develop this idea of now a shared sort of false language, culture, history that everyone can exist under. And fashion can be a really great way to also build cultural production, right? The same way that something like art might be, right? When we talk about these cultural commodities, it becomes a really great forward-facing way to present yourself to other nations. And so I think that fashion is just a really accessible point for people, especially because when we talk about the Cold War, what we're talking about is the militarization of everyday life, right? We talk a lot about things like the really famous kitchen debates and the ways that there's a lot of discussions of how you, as a member of the idealized household or family or citizen, are able to combat things like communism and capitalism in your everyday life. And that means your buying practices and your consumption practices and your everyday practices. And everyone has to get dressed every day, and everyone has to go shopping for those clothes every day. And so I think that we've had discussions in the past that might be things like your appliances or your foods, but we haven't necessarily had these larger scale discussions of dress. And we haven't necessarily had these larger scale discussions of dress in which we are acknowledging the fact that the hierarchy continues to exist within France rather than this being just, does the US or USSR have better fashions?
Mhm. And then how do synthetics then fit into that picture?
Yeah, I mean, synthetics were really the thing that got me interested in all of this in the first place. Is I have a master's in fashion history from FIT, and I have some background in what is essentially fashion and textile history. And I originally started by looking, my master's thesis was on comic books, and I was really, really interested in this idea of invented imaginary synthetic fabrics, right? Like the idea of what is a superhero suit going to be made of. And you realize in a lot of these comics, they're sort of something like a Fantastic Four. They're like, wow, this is an incredible, like unstable molecule, mystery, wonderful fabric. And I was like, well, that's actually coming from this idea that we're inventing a bunch of brand new fabrics in real time. And we really feel the sense of possibility that we don't know what we could be able to invent or what's going to come next. And that was so interesting to me. And so then I really got to looking at like, well, what are those real fabrics that are being invented and what do they do and what are their properties? Like, how do they actually perform as performance textiles? And so that was the thing that really got this started. But then I realized that by the time you've sort of hit comic books, you've really saturated mass culture, right? You're aiming to make references that you feel like the average like junior reader is going to be able to understand. And so at that point in time, I was like, well, then where are these references coming from or originating from in the first place? And so that's what got me really interested in synthetics. But then the more I learned, the more I was like, well, there's really something here that I feel like pun-wise, the threads haven't been pulled on yet, right? So um, when we talk about sort of Cold War fashion, and especially in France, the thing that people usually think of is Christian Dior's new look, right? Like that becomes, and then I realized it becomes a blanket term for sort of these new aesthetic or technological developments that are all happening throughout the period to the point where Eisenhower's like Cold War foreign policy becomes branded the new look policy, and it is intended to be based off of Christian Dior's new look. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm sorry. That we're just not gonna, no one's written about that before. And I was like, well, that's the space, that's the in, and I came to realize that when it comes to these examples of synthetics, what we're really looking at is chemical warfare, right? We're looking at the fact that these same manufacturers, whether it be DuPont, whether it be like the East German chemical triangle, like whether it be the Lyon like textile manufacturers, they've all now built this technology for World War II, or they had it a little bit before, right, in that pre-war period, and now they have the ability to pivot to be making all of these chemical developments that were used for actual like warfare and chemical weapons into now civilian products because they have all of these factories with nothing to do with them. And the thing that they are able to actually do with them is produce textiles on a mass scale because the production of synthetics is a relatively easy thing to make. By which I mean the molding technology doesn't have to be particularly sophisticated because when you think about a piece of thread, it's just like a really long tube that goes on forever, right? Like it doesn't have to be molded into anything complicated. So relatively the like upfront cost to actually be able to put that machinery into these factories that are sort of already set up for this infrastructure is pretty easy in a sense. And so there becomes this just really large pivot towards this being the push where we think about the space race and we think about all of the technologies that are being developed. And I think that synthetics and chemical technology fit really well into that narrative in a way that people haven't really discussed before.
Mhm. I'm glad you mentioned the space race being another sort of non-strictly military application of new technologies, but taking place in this larger context of geopolitical rivalry. Could you perhaps explain how the space race and synthetic textiles fit together here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of people don't realize that 20 of the 21 layers that are in the original Apollo spacesuit are all materials that you nowadays find in the real world applicable actually as wearable garment
Mm,
textiles.
mhm.
And so we're talking about things like neoprene, we're talking about nylons, we're talking about sort of like Lurex, which would be like the spray technology that makes things shiny, right? Like all of those were originally developed sort of alongside space technology and alongside the building of the space suit. And so these really are, I think people think of the fabrics as being made for space first and then hitting the mass market. And that's not necessarily, I mean, these technologies are incredibly expensive to be researching, to be developing. And so it actually becomes, in order to fund public perception about the space race, or to be able to fund public perception that is specifically about why we should be developing technologies in what's supposed to be a not wartime period, that it actually really helps if the mass market is already on board with the novel applications and the ability for them to buy in. When we talk about a place like DuPont, right, they're not making the final product, but they have the licensing technology. For something like nylon, they hold a worldwide license for years prior to that actually being given to anybody else to make nylon. So it's sort of anytime you buy a nylon anything, that money is in its own way still trickling back into like the DuPont pocketbook, right? So it's within their best interest of, oh, if we can get everybody to buy this, then we're going to get the kickbacks from all of that, and which means that we're going to find as many diverse applications for that material as possible, not just to put it in space, right? Because space is basically the most expensive thing that we could ever try and pay for. And so that money really has to come from somewhere. And we don't want it to just be coming like from the government during this point in time, because you want to also be able to have things like defense systems if nuclear war does break out, right? So you want to be as smart as possible about how you're actually raising that money, and putting it into the mass market is a really, really smart way to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you've mentioned DuPont a couple times, so I imagine that's what brought you to Hagley. Am I correct?
Yeah, that is. I mean, DuPont's a huge part of this project. You sort of can't have discussions of chemical technology during the Cold War without DuPont. And especially because DuPont was very, very involved with French couturiers in terms of actually holding official partnerships that were these endorsements of these synthetic textiles. So in the archive, there's really wonderful visits that Christian Dior actually took to the factory. There are really great press releases that were done by the PR department that are, these are the clothes that were put out in the French couture season. These are the designers. This is what the fabric was, what it like, this was the look it was made for. This was the textile manufacturer that they bought it from. So it's actually a really great way to trace the actual supply chain of how these fabrics are actually being made. And there's a lot of information at Hagley as well relating to which factories they sort of deem worthy of receiving the licensing technology, how many factories they want to receive those licenses, because they don't necessarily want to oversaturate the market. They want to be able to hold some level of like quality control over the synthetic fabrics that are actually being put out, so that they do match what the public's perception of luxury would be. And so there's just like a really, really wonderful wealth of documentation that allows me to trace not just the idea that synthetics are luxury, but at every sort of step of the process, how they got there. And we're able to create that widespread public perception to then endorse those materials. So Hagley's been really wonderful to sort of be my first archival visit to kickstart this project, but I know that I will definitely be back because just in the short amount of time that I was able to be here, I was able to come across so much. And I know that, um, not every piece of information is going to be these beautiful PR like news photographs. Sometimes it is going to be me having to sift through a lot of business meeting documents about who you decide to give a license to, when they actually get that license, how they train the employees on how to use all of those machines. And a lot of that is just like the thicker, juicier reading material that you really have to sit down with. So it's been a really wonderful experience to visit Hagley, and it's one that I'm looking forward to having again.
Oh, terrific, because we do support repeat visits. Now, I'm wondering um, what the perhaps reaction or reception in France was, particularly amongst these high fashion types, to these overtures from the business world, and perhaps especially to this location in between capitalist and communist blocs that you've described them as occupying.
Right. I mean, that's a key part of this project, right? Is especially when you're looking at French intelligentsia during the period, they are very resistant to the idea of Americanization, right? They there is very active fighting. Probably most people know sort of the story of how resistant France was to having Coca-Cola products as being for them, the symbol that they were sort of being taken over, right? And the reason that French couture works so well, one is because there's an incredibly long history and legacy of French couturiers using synthetic and semi-synthetics. A really great example is someone like Schiaparelli was very well known for using cellophane in her fashions. And so this idea that I guess synthetic materials equal cheapness is something that's kind of come up over time, because there's sort of been less and less quality control when it comes to the actual production of synthetic materials. But at the time when these are new technologies, you really want to make sure that you're sort of perfecting that process. And so they don't have that same level. They're seen as something novel is good, right? Novel is seen as innovative for these couturiers to be engaging with. The idea of France being this arbiter and like leader and tastemaker means that they want to be the first ones using the novel materials because they don't want to be seen as behind the times or not setting the stage. So it's very advantageous for them actually to be the first ones who are getting their hands on these materials. And you can actually see that there is a lot of excitement, especially in sort of that 1969 with the introduction of DuPont Kiana nylon. There's a huge rush for couturiers to sort of be the first ones who get to make garments out of that fabric in particular. And so one, it is really interesting because you would expect that there would be this resistance to using American products or having the Americanization, but I think that this deferment to French luxury as still being the hierarchy is the thing that sort of allows it to exist in a partnership. Because we are looking at the end of World War II, like France has been occupied by the Nazis. And so they have really lost this sense of getting to feel like a world power. However, they're still able to hold on to this idea that they are a cultural power, right? By continuing to reaffirm this idea that their aesthetics, their artwork, this French way of life and cultural products are still seen as the best. And so they're going to find a way to hold on to that, even if they can't also keep it on a larger geopolitical scale. And so I think that in general is why these products are accepted so well, is because it continues to sort of reaffirm that French hierarchy. A really great example that I love to give it is a bit American, but it fits the metaphor really well, is that in the ballroom of the Titanic, the original floors with the grand staircase and entryway are linoleum. And that is because linoleum is has been invented that year. And so for them to put linoleum in the Titanic, they're like look at us make because it's more expensive than marble because they just figured out how to make it. And
Mm.
obviously, if we came in and we saw linoleum floors all over this ship, we would be like, what do you mean this is nice, right? But for them, that was a really big deal. And
Wow.
so there is still kind of that same thing happening when it comes to synthetics in the Cold War of being like, oh, this is really cutting edge. It's really cool that you're doing this. And because there's just this strong legacy of France already using these kind of products in their materials, it's not seen as a departure or any kind of like betrayal of what would be the values of French couture that have already been set out.
Mm. Well, Monica, that's just fascinating. Thank you for sharing with us.
Yeah, of course.
And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, you can join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.